It's been a great year for horror fans so far. We got excellent remakes of both Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space. On the horizon there's some other big titles like Alan Wake 2, Alone in the Dark, and more. On the other hand, some highly anticipated horror titles like Redfall and the Greyfall incident completely bombed on release, which leads us to Amnesia: The Bunker. It's the fourth Amnesia game, or third if you're not counting A Machine for Pigs, which was made by another studio. While it may not be as popular as Resident Evil or Dead Space, The Bunker has been doing very well since release, receiving near universal praise from fans and critics alike. But to understand how we got to this point, we need to go back in time. Way back in 2007, a couple Swedish indie devs released a game called Penumbra: Overture to the world. And while it didn't become a breakout hit, it saw enough success for them to release 2 additional Penumbra games in 2008. Again, these games did well enough in their own right, but Frictional didn't really hit the big leagues until they released Amnesia: The Dark Descent in 2010. At a time when most horror games consisted of combat and puzzle-focused survival horror tropes like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, Frictional took things in a completely different direction. Amnesia instead took all weapons away from the player and forced them to run or hide from any threats. While this design philosophy has become very common in horror games nowadays, you can largely thank Amnesia and Outlast for popularizing it. It may be a little hard to believe now, but this was almost revolutionary at the time. Amnesia took the internet by storm, becoming the default title for YouTube Let's Players. Lots of big names like PewDiePie and Markiplier grew their channels alongside Amnesia by posting videos of their over-the-top reactions while playing the game. I personally had a great time playing The Dark Descent back in the day, but I can see how some parts of it may have aged a little poorly nowadays. It's still worth playing if you like the series though, don't get me wrong. Overall, The Dark Descent was a huge success, but instead of jumping directly into a sequel, Frictional began work on the game that would eventually become Soma. Knowing that this new project would be a very long endeavor, they hired the Chinese Room, a narrative-focused indie studio, to start on the next Amnesia. And 3 years later we received Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs. Unlike Frictional's Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs was very light on the puzzle and stealth sections. In fact, it was pretty bare on gameplay in general, but playing to their strengths, the game was heavily narrative focused. I think this is probably the lowest point in the series, although it does have a pretty good payoff in the end. If you're looking for a slower, more poetic experience with minimal gameplay and a killer ending, you might just be the target audience for this game. Regardless, after the lackluster reception from A Machine for Pigs, Frictional was under pressure to make some big waves with their next title, Soma. And waves they did make. Get it? It's an underwater game. Just never mind. Going back to their roots, they brought the non-combat horror philosophy to the bottom of the ocean. Instead of the fantasy-themed Dark Descent, Soma was raw sci-fi horror. And boy did they deliver on this one. I don't think it reached the same level of YouTube reaction bait that The Dark Descent did, but it was absolutely killing it with more mature audiences. Personally, I think Soma is their best game by far. It just does so many things amazingly well that no other horror game can really come close to. Particularly the setting, characters, and story. All incredibly memorable and quite haunting to think about even after a long time. Moving on, Frictional decided to return to the Amnesia series with Rebirth. A new take on the classic formula, albeit this time with a more impressive production value. I think a lot of people gave this one lukewarm reviews because it didn't do much to reinvent the series, mostly playing like The Dark Descent 2.0 or something. But I'm actually a little more fond of this one looking back on it now. Sure, it still follows that same basic gameplay formula, but the story is much more engaging than the original, and the sci-fi elements that creep into the later parts of the game are actually very cool. To keep it simple, if you'd like Scorn, this one might be the game for you. However, due to the middling reviews, things seem to be in another Machine for Pigs situation over at Frictional, at least as an outsider looking in. They released a decent game that made some money, but it wasn't a breakout hit like The Dark Descent. To keep on growing as an indie studio, they needed another Soma to really turn things around. I'm happy to report that we received just that with Amnesia: The Bunker. As of recording this, it's sitting at a 92% positive on Steam with over 2,500 reviews. That's pretty impressive, considering Rebirth has barely doubled that, despite being 3 years older. Now that's great and all, but what actually makes it stand out from its predecessors? Well, glad you asked, hypothetical commenter. From a game design standpoint, The Bunker is by far the most experimental game Frictional has put out. The most obvious changes lie in the numerous systems that weren't present in any of the other Amnesia titles. From non-linear design to actual combat mechanics, this is a huge turning point for the series. Instead of that sneak and do puzzles loop of the past, The Bunker plays more like a modern survival horror game. There's still some light puzzles and plenty of sneaking, but now you've got a heaping helping of gameplay on top of that. However, it goes beyond the standard design of games like Resident Evil or Dead Space, where there's generally only one way forward and one specific way to accomplish your goals. Instead, they embraced many elements of the immersive sim genre, opening up a lot of the game to individual creativity and experimentation. For example, let's consider the door problem. You see, doors in games are something that seem extremely simple to the average player, but are actually very difficult when it comes down to game design. There's a pretty popular article written by Liz England on the door problem. Let's take a look at that. Premise: you're making a game. Are there doors in your game? Can the player open them? Can the player open every door in the game? Or are some doors for decoration? How does the player know the difference? Are doors you can open green and ones you can't red? Is there trash piled up in front of doors you can't use? Did you just remove the doorknobs and call it a day? The list goes on. And that's just looking at doors from a design standpoint. What about all the other departments involved? Creative director. Yes, we'll definitely need doors in this game. Project manager. I'll put time on the schedule for people to make doors. Designer. I wrote a doc explaining what we need doors to do. Concept artist. I made some gorgeous paintings of doors. Art director. This third painting is exactly the style of doors we need. Environment artist. I took this painting of a door and made it into an object in the game. There's so many more examples in the original article, but I think you get the point. Something that might seem simple to the average player can turn out to be a massive headache for the developers. In The Bunker, doors are very complex obstacles with a wide variety of possible solutions. You have standard doors that can be opened and closed at will. You also have padlock doors, barred doors, metal doors, doors that require keys, doors with tripwires attached to them, and a whole lot more. In most games, you have to find a key to get past a locked door, but that's pretty much as far as it goes. Here, you have a ton of options at your disposal depending on the situation. You could search for a key, or you could blow it open with an explosive barrel, or a grenade, or a shotgun blast, or even lure the monster into breaking it down. And it's not just doors in your way, there's plenty of other obstacles too, like the bloodthirsty rats that congregate around corpses. You could shoot them, burn them with Molotovs, wave a torch to scare them off, throw some meat to distract them, or just use another path altogether. In fact, this open-ended approach to game design is much more akin to the immersive sim genre than standard survival horror. There aren't any rules stating that horror and immersive sim design philosophy can't mix. I mean, Alien Isolation is another example of this, giving the player a myriad of tools to handle most encounters. On the other hand, Alien Isolation doesn't fully embrace that open-ended design when it comes to things like interacting with the world and progressing through the game. If we're talking about immersive sim survival horror titles, The Bunker might be the top contender so far. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised to see them pull this off, because I'm also working on a survival horror immersive sim. I've mentioned it a bit in my past videos, but my upcoming project Ad Infernum also embraces this sort of open-ended design, focusing on player freedom in an otherwise oppressive setting. I actually had no idea Amnesia was delving into this territory until a couple months ago. Clearly they saw my random indie game nobody's ever heard of and decided to copy it, right? I'm just kidding. Like I said before, The Bunker is an excellent horror game and I wholeheartedly support more stuff like this in the future. But I still feel like I'm missing something here. All those systems are important, but they're not what really sells the game. Oh wait, I didn't even talk about the monster yet. Yeah, you probably thought I was gonna wrap up the video there, but we've got a whole nother section to do. So move your cursor off that recommended video and let's talk about the real spooky stuff. If you aren't already aware, Amnesia the Bunker mainly features one antagonist for the entire 4 to 6 hour runtime. There are a few other enemies, like the rats and one late game section I won't spoil, but the vast majority of your time will be spent dealing with the monster in one way or another. Like everything else in the game, the monster is highly interconnected with the design of nearly all the game's mechanics. I already mentioned how you can lure it to break open doors, but that's barely scratching the surface. You can scare it off with guns, flames, and explosives, but that only buys you a little bit of time before it comes barreling back at you. Besides, the limited resources and inventory space make the idea of direct combat very unappealing. So you'll generally be trying to stay very far away, or at the least hiding whenever it's nearby. In terms of non-combat solutions, the game provides you with a lot to do here. Light and sound are integral elements throughout. Things like running around, dragging objects, and even pulling the ripcord on your flashlight all create a great deal of sound that will attract the monster over time. Making enough noise will bring it out of the walls and headed towards your location. Of course, this can also be used to your advantage, like tossing a grenade to create a very loud distraction. The game even finds unique ways to turn this around on the player. Very minor spoiler warning for one mid-game section. If you want to skip it, you can just go to this part in the video. Okay, 3, 2, 1, continuing on. At one point, you meet a human prisoner locked up in the cells. He starts screaming as soon as he notices you're walking by. The amount of noise he makes is very quick to attract the monster, so what do you do here? Do you shoot him to stop the noise? Do you let him be a distraction and get eaten by the monster? Or do you avoid the area altogether to try and spare him? Interesting scenarios allow for interesting solutions. Speaking of which, one of the most interesting elements in the game has to be the generator. You see, there's a generator in the safe room that can illuminate the whole bunker while it's running, but it burns through fuel while it's on, which can only be found in very limited quantities around the map. While the lights are on, the monster will stay in the walls until you make enough noise to bring it out of one of the countless holes burrowed throughout the bunker. So the generator provides a certain amount of safety, allowing you to explore areas a little bit more freely until you hit the inevitable tripwire that brings it barreling back out. To account for the limited generator time, you get a stopwatch that you can sync with the generator clock, giving you a precise countdown until the lights go out again. All of these factors combine together for some very interesting scenarios. Do you want to waste precious inventory space carrying the stopwatch? Are you just going to scout out an area, or are you actually trying to make progress? Is it worth using this fuel on the generator, or should you turn it into a Molotov? Can you spare the space to lug all this fuel back to the safe room, or is the journey too long and dangerous to be worth it? And what happens when you're deep in one of the outer wings and the power goes out? Is it worth cranking the flashlight up so you can see, even if it means creating a lot of noise? There are so many possible situations that can arise from the interplay between these systems that make for a really compelling experience. I could go on and on about the excellent game design in the bunker, but I think it's best to just experience it for yourself. Unlike their past games, where everyone sees the same story and player agency isn't a huge factor, the bunker is completely unique to every player. Even if you've already watched someone play through the whole game, I still recommend picking it up for yourself. You're getting an excellently spooky experience that really respects player creativity, and you're helping fund all the future endeavors of a pretty cool indie studio. Speaking of supporting things, if you like videos like this and want to help support the channel, subscribing is always greatly appreciated. But seriously, go play the bunker, and if you like it, maybe try out some of their past games too. Soma is still one of the best horror games of all time, but Rebirth isn't half as bad as some people might make you think. Heck, even A Machine for Pigs is worth playing for the ending alone, but that's just my opinion. I hope you guys all enjoyed this more game design focused video. As always, I like trying out a bunch of different things to see what really sticks. But until next time folks, have a good one.